Recording in progress. Good morning, everybody. Actually, it's good afternoon. It's good morning where you guys, some of you guys are out in the Midwest. Um, uh, uh, Welcome to Conversations with Calvin, We the Species. And this is a special little panel that I've been greatly anticipating. And by the way, we've been talking about this, setting this up for a while, and now it's here, and we just sat and BS'd for an hour. The title of this panel is Lifeblood 2, based on a book that Gary Hill has put together, and Bill Camp and Del Merritt have contributed stories to that, which I've read last night. I created a very somber atmosphere for me to come in here. I lowered the lights. And I read from the PDF that Gary sent me the stories that have been put together, and they're horrific, vampiric, and as I said before we went on, and I'm so thrilled you guys are here, that my takeaway, my overwhelming takeaway from Lifeblood 2 is the believability of the stories that I read on the fiction side, and then there's a nonfiction element. So I'm so thrilled to spend this early June Sunday with you guys, and it's really fascinating. Your world is fascinating, and again, I'm really appreciative and thrilled you're here. So I've said my Johnny Carson monologue. Remember him, guys?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of humor here, but this is not humorous stuff. But I've done my Johnny Carson monologue, and let me first introduce Gary Hill, author, a music critic, the whole package. And Gary's been here before, so a little background, Gary.
Hi everyone. As Calvin said, you guys have probably been a little sick of hearing about me because I've been on Calvin's show so many times. But in this case, we're talking about Lifeblood 2. And I sort of came at that, I've actually I got into music journalism years ago because I was passionate about music. But honestly, if I went back far enough, it's the horror and the science fiction that was the real thing that drove me for so long. And I discovered music later and got really passionate about that too. So to me, probably my earliest from a horror point of view was Dark Shadows and Barnabas Collins. And so vampires have a very special place in my heart. But so, when I started writing, I think actually the very first horror story I remember writing was a vampire story, I think. And so, it's sort of a part of me. And I like doing, like, Lifeblood 2 obviously is a sequel to the first Lifeblood. And I just like sharing vampire stories. And I'm going to be doing one collecting all my vampire stories. I just wrote 2 more this last week that are going to go into it. And that's going to be probably next year. It's going to come out. So
Next
that's
up.
And then, like I said, I run Tales of Wonder and Dread Publishing,
Okay.
where we do science fiction and horror. And then also Spooky Ventures, where I do videos. I decided I wanted to get into videos because that seemed to be the wave of the future, and started doing some videos on there. But that's pretty much it.
Okay. Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Camp. I'm originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, which is very appropriate for a horror writer.
Right.
And I moved to Suffolk, Virginia, and believe it or not, now I live near a place called the Great Dismal Swamp. So horror just kind of follows me everywhere here in Suffolk. I'm also a member of the Horror Writers Association. We have t-shirts, Virginia chapter, living here in Virginia now. I'm a short story writer and poet of horror. Have published several items around these days, and including one vampire story in Lifeblood 2. So it's a lot of fun. I also teach Norfolk State University, traditionally Black university, and Paul D. Camp Community College And something that I might bring up later on here, I also work with individuals with intellectual disabilities a couple times a week.
Wow.
So I'm out there all over the place.
Wow. It's great. Next up, and this kind of really fits the motif of this Sunday afternoon gathering. We have Del Merritt, who's sideways, and the spirits that brought us together here have decided to put him sideways. But it's more important not to necessarily see him, but it's more important to hear his words. So Del, take it away.
It's really funny because I think, despite the fact that we're probably about 12 years apart, Gary and I, our stories are very similar. I grew up really being interested in horror movies and stories, and then got into music, and in a way, all those worlds kind of collided for me, and I mixed them all together. And I suppose that's how I first met Gary. Actually, was when he was doing the Strange Sounds of Cthulhu, which was a book he had written about, how so many musicians had been inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, and he had contacted, bands that were very popular and bands that nobody ever heard of, to talk about, that strange world where these places meet, these interests meet. And so if I were to say what my bio is, I'd basically just be saying the same thing Gary's saying. Dark Shadows was a huge influence on me when I was a kid. The big things for me when I was young were mythology and folklore, especially the darker ends of it. And of course, I went through the phase of astronomy and dinosaurs, as all kids do. But those other things just stuck with me. And I became a musician sort of accidentally, despite the fact that I was always interested in music. It just sort of happened. My brother started playing drums. My older brother started playing drums. And so that's what you do, so I just copied what he was doing. And when it came to art and writing, again, it was just something that I just picked up. I didn't really know why. And there was never a point where I sat down and said, oh, I'm going to be a writer, or I'm going to be a musician, or anything. And I just did it. And I find to this day that, especially with writing, I just have to do it. And I'm glad that I've finally been able to recently actually publish things, even though, they're not very widely read. There is some feeling of accomplishment and purpose to it, that I am constantly, churning out words and upon words. That's basically about it.
I do want to say that Del and I are Jersey guys, as opposed to you guys in the Midwest. What really draws me in, particularly now, is where Del lives and some of the experiences I've had paranormal wise. So my comment to you all out there about Lifeblood 2, which we're going to talk about now, is as I was reading it and taking my notes as a due journalist, is the believability of the stories you're talking about, many of which are vampiric, and it's the airs that you create. It makes it really believable, and you kind of scratch your head. And a lot of these stories really draw you in. And as I said to Bill, the story that he had contributed kind of ticked me off, because I got really into the character, and then whatever, I'm not giving nothing away. So anyway, Gary, let's start talking about Lifeblood 2, the origins and how and who and where.
Well, as I said, I'm big into vampire stuff. I've always loved vampire stuff. And very early on, I started creating my own vampire universe, one short story at a time. And I decided there needed to be some kind of consistency of rules and things. And if you really look at vampire fiction, those rules tend to vary from one writer to another. And I decided, okay, I'm going to create an entire universe of vampires, but it's going to be one short story at a time versus one long book or a number of novels. And so over time, I've been writing these. And in 2018, when I first launched Tales of Wonder and Dread, one of the first 3 books I launched was Lifeblood, which was a collection of vampire stories. I had several of mine in there. And we didn't have any nonfiction that time around. I don't know why, I just wasn't looking at doing that at that time. And so then there was enough, I had enough fiction, and I knew there was enough other stories out there. And I thought, well, you know what, let's do a second one. And so I decided to put this one together. And I thought, there have been a lot of stories that are supposed true life vampires. And so I thought, well, let's talk about some of those in there. Let's do a nonfiction section. I should say, when you talk about the believability, you know, I'm someone who's very interested in paranormal stuff. I'm very interested in all that stuff. I've gone out of my way to put myself in experiences to try to get some of that stuff. The problem with me is, and my wife says I could see a ghost face to face and I'd be coming up with some other explanation for it, is I'm always looking at the scientific angle, and I'm very much a disbeliever. I want to believe, but it's going to take an incredibly high level of evidence to convince me of anything. So, you know, from my point of view, everything has to have a scientific basis of some sort. And so when I write fiction like that, even, yeah, there's a fantasy angle. There are things that I don't really explain. For instance, if you read all my stories, I never get into too many details about how someone converts someone into a vampire. There's a process, and I do mention this an involved process, but I never get into it because you really don't need that information. You just need to know that there's a process. But I do need certain scientific facts that sort of go from story to story to story. Like in my particular universe, some of the old legends were literally either created by, or they were at least perpetuated by the vampires as a way to distract people from what they were. Like the whole thing of vampires not having a reflection. Yes, they do, but they like that story being out there, because then when they see them with a reflection, well, that's not a vampire. You know, and one of the vampires in one of the stories, actually, I don't think it's in this one, but I think it's in some of the other ones, actually talks about how that's really silly. I mean, what happens with your clothes? They show up, but you don't show up. But, you know, so there's a whole factual scientific sort of angle I try to put in there. I mean, it's pseudoscience, I'm sure, but at least there's something there to kind of give it that sort of believability. And I try as much as I can to pull some real world stuff into it. I mean, obviously these people live in some alternate world, alternate universe, but like the story with the Beatles, I made sure I had all the facts and the dates and everything right, knew what hotel they were at, knew what the dates were. And also when I talked about the gentleman who's the vampire in that one, who's the narrator, I made sure I got the facts about his military service right. And, you know, things like that, so that it actually has a believability to it. Now, I should mention that the other fiction stories in there from other people are not in the same shared universe. My 6 fiction stories all are. You know, so I guess that's basically what I would say about Lifeblood 2, except that we've also got some really good, I like the range of the stories. I mean, my story, I Saved the Beatles, I honestly don't even think of that as a horror story. I think that's sort of a feel-good vampire story. And of all the vampire characters I've written, I think that's probably the most noble character. He's actually probably a good guy. He never really does anything that's questionable. He's trying to be a good person. Some of the other characters, especially when I've gotten into some later stuff, some of the other characters, I mean, they present things as, yes, I'm a good guy, but really, if you look at what they're doing, they're not. They're actually monsters. Still, vampires are monsters. I mean, they survive on other people for their existence. And I mean, I suppose you could say that for any life form, but you know, I mean, we all live on other life forms, but that particular character is actually a very noble vampire. There's another one, the one in No Sugar Plums. That character is a very noble and good character, but they're the exceptions. I mean, all of them think they're good. It's like you read about any kind of a story. The supervillains always think they're the good guy. You know, they always have an angle in their own mind where they're the good guy. And these vampires think the same thing too. They're just surviving. They're doing what they have to do, but you know, they're not good guys, really. But yeah, what I was saying is that the other stories in there are not in the shared universe, just mine are. But we have another one, Vampire Edna from R.C. Mulhare. That story is actually very funny. I think that's sort of a really dark, humorous story. So there's a wide range of stuff in there.
By the way, the No Sugar Plums, I got a kick out of, again, I'm not an expert in this stuff, but I got a kick out of the name he took, Vincent Kolchak.
Yes, now that, okay, so it started with Dark Shadows, and then when Night Stalker came on, I was a huge Night Stalker fan. And so and I still am, and we've got all the movies and we've got the whole series on disc, and I watch it every weekend. But you know, when I was looking for a name for the journalist to take, I mean, that journalist really, in my head, was always Kolchak anyway. And so I thought, well, we'll take Vincenzo and combine that with Kolchak, and we get Vincent Kolchak. So that was a definite nod to.
Oh, yeah, and you know, we'll talk about. I watched Kolchak, and talk about believability.
Oh yeah,
It was so. That's to me, one of the magnificent aspects to his character is, man, that you just believe this stuff. My goodness.
one of my friends said, you know, there was a movement to get a second season of that show, and Darren McGavin was actually not a proponent of getting a second season because he had a lot of extra work thrown on him, and I don't think he was really happy with the direction a lot of it was going in. But one of my friends said, who actually has something in here, Mike Korn, who actually has a nonfiction piece in here. Mike said that, you know, he thinks that if they had actually gotten the second season of that show, that Kolchak would go down in history as one of the greatest characters in television ever.
Correct.
And I think he's probably right. That character was so great.
So great. It's so great to take that subject and make it so real and believable. That's why it was such a great character. You know, you have to scratch your head. It was just great. I wasn't aware it was only one season. I didn't. Anyway, moving on. Bill, you gave your intros, and I am looking. I got a. Well, we talked about. You wrote The Vampire's Haunted House.
Yes.
So you know, well, I'll ask this to all of you, but where does all this inspiration, where do these ideas, how does that come to you?
Well, for me anyway, it was I mean, you have your haunted house movies, you got your haunted house subgenre of horror, and you have your vampire subgenre of horror. So I thought, well, what if we combined a couple of things? You know, have the vampires, why the house is haunted. You know, and my character, Tim Morgan, was inspired because I do work with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and people sometimes try to take advantage of them. So it's an exploitation factor going on in there. So I felt like, you know, how would he do in a situation like that? You know, thrust into it by quote unquote friends who, you don't really feel like they're real friends to him anyway. For thrusting him in there. But so you know, I mean, I also play, I don't want to give away too much of the ending either, but with some of those tropes that we always know about vampires, you know, like should they really die in the sunlight, you know, those kinds of things. And what happens when they dissolve, can they still come back, and in those kinds of ideas. So, to me, it's always been amazing how much everyone thinks what they know about vampires actually came from Bram Stoker. It's just, it's kind of amazing. And even in it was changed in the movies, because in Bram Stoker's Dracula, vampires don't die in sunlight.
Wow.
Yeah, they become mortal, is what he says. You could, hit him in the head with a club or something and maybe kill him in the sunlight, but you couldn't, but it just amazes me how much of what everyone thinks they know about vampires actually just came from Bram Stoker. Not even, and very little of his his original novel, Dracula, came from the original legends. A little bit of it, but not much. Wooden stakes might be one of the only things. And I mean, he came up with his own things that make vampires more powerful and less powerful, right? A rose on the coffin would contain him in the coffin, and you could not open the coffin if a simple rose was put on there. So I think it's kind of cool what Gary was saying with some of his things, to create your own version of what makes a vampire stronger and weaker, and create your own mythology, if you will, of vampires. And I think that's that's always cool for anyone to do, right? Doesn't have to follow the Bram Stoker motif, or even the ancient legends from Europe or anywhere else in the world. You can almost create your own with them.
Which is what you do. Which is
absolutely
absolutely what you do. It is. I'm not giving anything away either, but it was a hell of an ending. We talked about it before we went on air. I'm not even going to tell you about my emotionality from the ending, but because you start with everything, you build an attachment to a character. Sometimes you find some ways to identify with the character. The card game.
Yeah, I understand. I've always been a fan of tragedies. I'll just say that much, right?
Well, tragedy is reality.
It is, unfortunately.
Yes, and we have to deal with that. So moving on to Mr. Sideways. By the way, that was a great movie. Completely off topic, with your own movie people. That movie Sideways.
I never saw it.
You never saw it?
No, I'm just living it.
Oh, yeah, you are living it. Great movie. I watch it every couple of months because it's a story. Just a wonderful movie. I identify with it because the main character is an author, and he ain't getting published so quickly, and anyway, it has to deal with drinking and Sideways. But anyway, you're Sideways, and a murder of convenience. Yeah, I have to say, it really makes you think. And we discussed this before we went on air. You really, I tip my hat to you because it made me really think and ponder and try to figure things out, which is, I guess, part of your intent.
Yeah, I wanted one part of it to be fairly obvious what was going on, and that was revealed at the very end, with the husband, his interest in what was happening. But the other one, I wanted to be much more subtle and kind of people have to figure it out themselves and piece it together. And in fact, I actually had to go back and rewrite the ending of that to make sure that it stood out more, because as vague as it is now, it was a lot more vague before. So yeah, and again, you trying to not give anything away. It's a very short story, so you figure it out pretty early on what's going on. I'd just like to touch on what the other guys were saying about how we all create our own universe for different characters that may come from folklore or whatever. I have a ton of vampire stories. Very few, only a handful are sort of separate from longer series that where they're not necessarily the main character of the story, but somebody that the protagonist of those series would meet. But I did do basically the same thing as Gary did. I like his angle that the stupid things that people believe about vampires were made up by vampires so that they could say, "Oh, I'm not a vampire. You can see me in the mirror." Yeah, vampires are my stories. I think the vampire in Murder of Convenience is probably the most classic in the way that we think of them from films. There's sort of an elegantness about that vampire. But in most of my other stories, vampires are not what they believe they are, and they're certainly not what people believe they are. They, though they may be attractive, they're still corpses. And the one element that I put in now and again is that when they go to sleep at night in their coffin, which they don't have to sleep in the coffin, they just need to be out of the sun, or so they go to sleep in the day, rather. Sorry, they're not actually sleeping; they're actually dying again, and so they become a completely lifeless corpse as they would have been before they were resurrected. And then when the sun goes down, or whatever signals the time for them to get up, they go through this long process of extremely painful process of coming back to life. And there are other characters that note this, and they're saying, "Look, this is not something you want. It's not romantic. It's not fun." Yeah, once they've come back to life, it even takes them a while to sit there and figure out what the hell has just happened to me, and then they get on the stick and say, "Oh yeah, I got to go eat somebody." So yeah, and then the means of death, I like to use some of the old ones. Sunlight, I like. Something through the heart. It doesn't have to be wooden stake. In a lot of the folklore, it had to be particular types of wood, like hawthorn. If you use just balsa wood or something like that, or plywood, it wouldn't work. And then beheading or fire. If you completely burn something to death, no matter what it is, it's just gone. So yeah, I again, like Gary was saying, we all create our own worlds of how these creatures exist. In one of my other vampire stories that belongs to a series of stories that take place in the 18th century, and they're about a pirate named William Dethridge. Like Kolchak, he always ends up getting into these trouble with supernatural things. Like, that shouldn't happen to a pirate. You just go and you steal things and you drink and die. But in the first story that I wrote with him, he encounters a vampire who has the ability to reanimate corpses. So basically, he's got to get through zombies, then he's got to deal with the vampire, who actually turns out to be a Chinese nobleman who somehow got brought over to England in the 1700s. And once they take care of the vampire, they all of a sudden have to deal with a demon that was basically the patron of that vampire. The vampire worshipped this demon, which shows up in the form of a gigantic spider. And so when you kill the vampire at the very end, his head goes flying off, and everybody's like, "Phew, all right, well, let's get back to sea and go have fun." Well, no, now a giant spider comes after you. So that was called the Curse of the White Spider, and I get a lot of good feedback on that one. It's fun adventure, but with horror thrown in.
I wanted, because we'll get to shortly, talking about classic horror, but this is unclassic, but perhaps classic. Your impressions, if you've seen it, I'm sure you have, the movie Fright Night. Have you all seen that?
The one with Roddy McDowell from the 80s?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've seen both versions.
Okay.
I own both versions, actually.
Because my son, he's a horror fan, and he and I watched we watch it a lot. We haven't watched it, but my point is, it's so real.
one of the things I would say about the original film is I think it may very well have been the first, and if not the first, it was very early in the horror comedy genre, because it's definitely got the comedic angle to it and a very camp sort of angle. And it's a really fun movie. I know it's blasphemy to a lot of people, but I actually prefer the remake from a few years ago. But I'm kind of biased because David Tennant's in the remake, and David Tennant's my all-time favorite actor. And also, I think the movie's just a little more serious, and the threat seems a little more real. It's still got a comedic angle to it, but it's less so than the first one. I think it's
Right.
less campy. I mean, the first one had Roddy McDowall, though. How can you go wrong with Roddy McDowall? But I don't know what anybody else's opinion is on it.
Been a little while since I've seen it, but
Okay.
but yeah, I thought it was pretty good. A lot of those 80s movies, I guess any movie from any era, it gets kind of dated with especially the hair in the 80s. It's one thing. But the vampire angle is very strong in that. And I think by the time you get to Night Fright, you're probably starting to see maybe some Anne Rice vampire influence anyway coming in.
She did Conversations with a Vampire.
Interview with the Vampire, and really a whole series then too. Then the
Okay.
Vampire Lestat came out right around the same time as that movie, I believe, or pretty close to it anyway. The sequel, which is actually more of a prequel, but anyway.
Okay. No, for me, Fright Night is just a scary, because you take the world of vampires and put it into, well, back in the 80s, but in contemporary times, contemporary everything, it's a dance scene and Evil Ed, and I mean, it's just all my son and I actually were so enamored with that movie that a couple of years ago, Brewster and Evil Ed were at a Chiller Theater. Do you guys know about that? Do you know about it, though?
Yeah, I've gone a couple times.
Yeah, a Chiller Theater. It had, I guess, it had its origins way back, bringing in horror characters and having them man tables and doing autographs and stuff and selling paraphernalia. But it expanded, and it has grown to where tens of thousands of people go to these things here in Jersey. And we're not talking about just horror. We're talking about former major, Cloris Leachman was there. I mean, I'm just trying to, some major stars are there. The one they just had, well, so my son and I went because we saw that Brewster and Evil Ed were going to be there. So we have pictures with them. Of course, we told them both how much we love Fright Night, and it scares the hell out of us still. Going back to Lifeblood 2, do you want to touch on the nonfiction element? Because some of that stuff is great stuff. I mean, it's like, wow.
Yeah, like I said, I wanted to go ahead and include some nonfiction. And when I do my nonfiction stories, they're basically short little research papers. And I go through research stuff. And I mean, we got two from Rick Hale, though, which were older ones that he did. And my friend Mike Korn has one in there, which was one he published at Wormwood Chronicles. And the funny thing was I came across that one sort of by accident, because I remembered, I mean, I write for Wormwood Chronicles, and so does Bill, I believe. But
I have.
You
I
have.
haven't in a while, but
You haven't in a while, okay. So Bill also has collaborated with Mike Korn and Wormwood. And I remembered I was doing something on Elizabeth Bathory for it, and I some reason I had remembered that I had read one that Mike Korn had done. about Elizabeth Bathory, and I got digging through, and it turned out it was just a small piece of the article he had done. But I thought, well, this would be a good one to reproduce. And so I talked to Mike about it and got permission, and he did that one. And my wife, Diane, I like to a lot of times will, say, hey, you want to get something in this one? She's great at doing the research paper kind of things too. And so she did the Highgate vampires in London. I got researching some of these. It's interesting when you look at the historical, again, I'm very much a skeptic, and I know Bill and I talked about when I did a chat with him, and pretty much everybody else who I've done a chat with so far about this book, none of us really believe that there is such a thing as real life vampires. But there are things that have inspired vampire stories over the years. And one of the things that came up a lot of times when researching these, and there were some I didn't actually write about because there just wasn't enough information. They weren't different enough from some of the others. But one of the most common things that was misinterpreted as vampirism way back when was consumption, which is tuberculosis. And a lot of it was because the people would just sort of waste away. And when they would cough up blood. And that led to a lot of the vampire things. So a lot of people who died of consumption were later dug up because other people would start to get sick because they caught tuberculosis too. But the superstitious people of the time thought, well, they're a vampire. They're being attacked by the vampire that died. So they dig up the corpse and do whatever they had to do. There were all kinds of different methods. But so that was kind of a really common thread. But there were some other really interesting stories in there that I came across. One of which was a story about a vampire in Louisiana, and maybe 100 years ago. And that's a pretty fascinating little tale because the entire thing seems to be a hoax made up maybe 20 years ago. Somebody came up with some thing that was supposed to be the heart of this vampire in a box. And they put it up for sale on eBay. Well, as it turns out, it was a fake. It was designed by some company that does movie props. And they apparently suddenly, after they put that out there were all these stories about this vampire that had been hunted down in sort of one of the weirdest, like, buddy cop stories, because there was a Catholic priest and a voodoo priest who got together to hunt this vampire down. And they didn't believe in what each other believed, but they got together because this vampire needed hunting and the police couldn't find him. And, it's a total Hollywood story if you think about it. Yet people actually believe it's true, but there's no evidence anywhere that it ever actually happened. Another one that I found really fascinating was the Gorbals vampire in Scotland, because while I found no evidence that it actually was an influence on the movie The Lost Boys, you've got a bunch of kids who decide there's a vampire in their town. And rather than try to enlist the parents and the adults, they just band together to go to hunt down this vampire. And, there was a lot more involved than that, but it's a pretty fascinating story. So again, I don't believe that there's such a thing as a real life vampire, but there have been some pretty fascinating little vampiric legends that have led to frenzies and things like that. And it's all fascinating stuff and good stories.
It is fascinating.
I have a question for Gary real quick, if you don't mind. You brought up that TB thing because, they used to, vomit blood, things like that. It reminded me, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Have you ever seen Andy Warhol's Dracula, also known as Blood for Dracula, I believe? I believe that's
part of it.
Yeah, because there's a scene in the world of that vampire story, Dracula can only survive if he drinks the blood of virgins. They have to be virgins. So this aristocrat has 3 daughters, and he wants to marry them off. Of course, they don't know he's a vampire. They bring him in, and he bites each one of them, and then none of them are virgins, but the father thinks he is. So through the whole movie,
Wow.
It's kind of a dark comedy, actually.
Wow.
Throughout the movie, he's biting each daughter and then getting violently ill and throwing up blood. And they actually think he has tuberculosis.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So the family's actually like, this is great. He's going to die. We're going to get all this money. It's actually a really good if you don't mind, a
Okay.
little disgusting, but
Wow.
it's actually really good. It's hilarious, I thought.
Yeah,
I
Blood
have a
for
morbid humor.
Dracula and Fresh Flesh for Frankenstein.
He did also do Flesh for Frankenstein,
Yeah.
yes, which is a little less charming, but
Yeah. No, they're
But yeah.
fun watches though.
yeah. Also known as Andy Warhol's Frankenstein as well.
Yeah, he
yeah.
had nothing to do with any of that. He just
Not really. He
money.
put his name to it, and that was about it.
Yeah.
You know, something just popped into my head. You know, Andy Warhol, this, that, and you mentioned Frankenstein, and this is off topic, but it's provocative. A few years ago, I went to a conference called Singularity as a journalist, and Singularity is promoted by Ray Kurzweil, who's got about 160 PhDs. He invented the Kurzweil keyboard. I mean, he's a genius. But his thing is, and it pertains to you guys. His thing is, what happens in 2040 when man and machine merge, become one? I mean, it's provocative. And he put together, he's got a university, Singularity. They deal with the scientific elements, they deal with the ethical elements. You know, is Jeff Bezos, going to be the one who's going to be able to become immortal? But here's the point I wanted to, dealing with Frankenstein, I'm throwing this out to you guys. There, and I sat for 3 days listening to all these. They had Ken Jennings there, the guy who won millions of dollars on Jeopardy, and he was priming himself to compete against the IBM's Watson computer. Interesting stuff. But they had it. Here's my point. They had a Russian scientist who was working on transferring this. In other words, if you want to take a file and and transfer it to another place, you stick the wire in and you transfer all the elements of a file to wherever you want to put it, to another file, to a portable, a portable drive. Point being, this Russian scientist talked for an hour on taking the elements of this and transferring it to a cyborg. And therefore, this, you, me, in the body of a cyborg, which is eternal, it lives forever. But so you, all of us could live forever, because this is what makes us human, this thing up here. And you put it into a cyborg, like Arnold Schwarzenegger. But anyway, it's funny, they had 3 days of speakers, that's the only thing I remember. And it was very provocative. And this Russian scientist said it's going to happen soon. And what do we, and therefore, it's just very provocative. One of my favorite subjects in life is old movies. So if we could drift a little bit into old movies, build that's one of your things. And by the way, you have a site on Facebook. Why don't you talk about that and your affectation with old movies?
I do. I have a Facebook group called Classic Camps, Classic Horror Emporium. And it is amazing to me that I have well over 800 members now, because I started with literally 10 people. Gary Hill mentioned Mike Korn. He was one of the 10 originals. He was among them, and it just grew from there. And we do a lot of classic horror discussion. I try to keep the rules as loose as possible, and so far it's worked. Knock on wood. Because I rarely have any trouble with people squabbling or anything. But but we do. I did come up with a list of the top, what I felt anyway, with the top 100 classic horror movies of all time. And I kind of put that as sort of a guide so people can see, you know, the eras that we talk about. But you know, we go everything from silent horrors, Dr. Caligari, into the usual universals, which are so popular. It started with Dracula, and then actually end with the House of Dracula as far as the original monsters go. Into the Hammers and the American International Pictures, Roger Corman, all those kinds of things. You know, we go into the 70s at least, you know, because that's when Hammer was, to me anyway, Hammer was the last real classic horror studio. I guess Hammer and AIP were both still around, but AIP was starting to change over into what's more modern horror, what we would consider more modern horror now. But we have a lot of fun. We post a lot of things, some jokes, some serious, some informative, you know, so I try to keep it open. And it is an emporium, so people can promote some of their works if it has to do, you know, if it's topic appropriate. It's actually encouraged. My rule again, I keep rules to be kind of fast and loose. My rule on that is just don't be annoying. You know, I think people know, you know, when they're being annoying. You know, just, you know, if you want to post something now and again, that you have when you have a book or a product or something, you know, go for it. It is an emporium. We're supposed to be selling things, and I do talk about products a lot as well. You know, this action figure's coming out. Check this out. One of my posts this past week is YouTube is getting ready to release the second season of the Godzilla cartoon, the Hanna-Barbera one from that went from 78 to what 80 or something. Anyway, late 70s. You know, so it's a lot of fun. We do a lot of vampires, a lot of Bela Lugosi because he's my favorite actor, and you know, I just can't help but love the guy. I also have a project that I've been working on. The Horror Writers Association actually gave me a scholarship to do research on it, and I'm writing a book on the history of Frankenstein in film.
Wow.
You know, so that touches on some Dracula pops up in there more often than you would think, actually.
So, talking about old films, we talked about it briefly before we went on air. And again, I'm not an expert and I'm not a movie critic, but I have to put the Wolfman pretty much at the top, at least in the top 4 or 5 horror films, because when I watch it, it is just one of the most emotionally evocative movies, and you feel such a great affinity to Larry Talbot and you know, his new girlfriend, and but anyway, your impressions of that.
He is one of my favorites as well. He always has been, especially with the old Universals, you know, the Dracula and Frankenstein and Wolfman and Invisible Man and all those other characters. He can't help but be tragic. He kills, not that he wants to, but he feels like, oh my God, I killed someone yesterday. You know, tonight I might kill again. You know, he says those kinds of things. You know, so it's he is definitely one of the most tragic because he's, you know, maybe it's that he's self-aware. You know, like the others, Frankenstein monster is just a big brute who doesn't know his own strength. Dracula has to kill to live. So, you know, he's kind of in that situation. But the Wolfman is more self-aware. He knows that he's a monster, but he's human as well. He just has that almost Jekyll and Hyde type split, to throw another monster out there. You know, so I've always, he was always one of my favorites as well. And another series that became one of my all-time favorites of, you brought up the Wolfman as well. It's definitely inspired by the Larry Talbot Wolfman, but I don't know if you've seen some of the Paul Naschy movies, Spanish horror movies. Yeah, they used to be on a lot of those hosted horror movie shows in the, I guess in the later years of them, in the 70s and early 80s. But he did something like 13 or 14 Wolfman movies called, his character was Waldemar Daninsky.
Wow.
And he brought a suave kind of aspect to it as well. It was almost like James Bond is the Wolfman is, you know, with these kinds of things. And he was always one of my favorites as well. He brought a lot of that as well. Definitely inspired by the Larry Talbot Wolfman. But if you get a chance, they're a little more cheaply made. They're Europe, late 60s into the 70s, and I think they go even into the 80s. And geez, I think his last one was into the 2000s somewhere there, somewhere around 2007 or 8 or something like that is one of the last ones that he did, just as Walt Martinsky. And so he's another favorite character of mine, definitely.
Hey, Calvin, if I may,
Yes.
I want to throw a little story out there, just a little true life story that I don't think I've ever put out there in an interview. And just because this is sort of a fun little story that ties into your Wolfman thing, and it helps to memorialize something my mother told me years ago. In the 50s, my mother and her first husband, who after they got divorced, she later remarried him and he became my stepdad. Anyway, they had a little restaurant in our area, and she would waitress and he would cook, and they ran this restaurant. So one night she's there and this guy comes in for dinner and she's serving him, and she keeps telling him, you look just like Lon Chaney. And she's like, my mother was very chatty. And so she's telling him about all these roles that she loved Lon Chaney in. And she's like, has anybody ever told you look like him? No. And when it gets time for him to leave, he writes a check. And sure enough, it was Lon Chaney Jr. He was in some sort of an event in the area and stopped in there for dinner.
Wow.
That's funny.
Great story. Great story. Hey, Del, you have a particular horror movie that is near the top of your list?
Yeah. I like all the old classic movies, the Universal guys, stuff like that. But they never really bit me the way that other things. They never really bit me the way they should have. Watching them as a little kid, I was never scared of them as much as just thinking that they were awesome. I do remember my little brother hiding whenever Frankenstein was on, he would hide behind a chair because he couldn't not watch it, but he wouldn't just go away. And I never felt that with those movies, but they're definitely near and dear to my heart. I gravitate more towards the stuff from the late 60s and early 70s. All those movies that Bill just mentioned, I've got every one of them. And I've always loved them. Two movies that are high on my list. Let's say 3 movies high on my list of horror movies. Probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite, would be The Blood on Satan's Claw, which is also known as Satan's Skin in Europe. Very non-traditional horror movie. First of all, it's a period piece. It takes place in the 1600s, and there's basically these children in a little English village unearth pieces of the devil, and they sort of form a cult where they're trying to bring him back to life, and his bits of him show up on different people, and so they have to go and catch those people and hack those bits off so they can assemble the devil. Very interesting story. And again, being so crazy into folklore the way I was, it ticked every button for me, and that's still to this day I have to watch it at least once a year. Following straight behind those, that would be like Vincent Price Conqueror Worm, or the Witchfinder General, they call it in Britain, which is basically a not very accurate retelling of the story of the Witchfinder Matthew Hopkins. And again, reading about that a lot when I was a kid. When I finally saw a movie of it, I was just like, awesome, thought it was great. And then of the Hammer films, as much as I love them all, Captain Kronos Vampire Killer is really high up there for me, because first of all, it's action and vampires mixed, which is great, but also the way they take various vampire folklore and put it into the movie, as well as saying that, look, no vampire is all the same. Some vampires are like the Dracula kind. Other vampires, might just drain your energy or something. And you had to discover what kind of vampire it was you were dealing with. And they very quickly did. And then they very quickly figured out, sort of by accident, what it was that would kill him. And it turned out it wasn't going to be a cross. It wasn't going to be a stake through the heart or anything. It was steel. This particular vampire had to be killed with steel. And so that was a huge one for me. That kind of reminded me of like the Solomon Kane stories where you're mixing the horror in with the adventure stuff. So it's like you're never going to get bored. Yeah, and your imagination is just going to go crazy. So those are the three real big ones for me. But yeah, there's tons of them that I like. I just I know honestly I can't think of any others right now.
Okay.
I'm sitting here looking at bookshelves with over 2,000 DVDs on them, and 90% of that is horror. So, unless I start reading those, I'm not gonna.
That's funny. Gary, your favorites.
If you want to go to the Universal, Creature from the Black Lagoon, without question, my favorite Universal monster and my favorite movie. There's just, I think, to me, that creature was more believable than some of the other ones. And it has the aspect that so many of the monster movies, from King Kong to Frankenstein to the Wolfman, all have, which is really, in a lot of ways, the creature is, the monster is actually the victim. I mean, the creature didn't ask these people to come there. He's just living his life being the creature. And they come and mess with him and, try to kill him and try to capture him. And everything ensues because they try to screw with his natural habitat. So from a Universal point of view, that's my favorite. In terms of favorite horror films, for many, many, many years, I'm a John Carpenter fanatic. And for many years, his Prince of Darkness was my favorite horror movie. One of the things I love about John Carpenter is how I call it the snowball effect, because it's like a snowball going down a hill. Everything starts really small and then it just starts building on itself. And all of a sudden, you don't know when it happened, but all of a sudden you're just in the midst of this complete insanity because everything's going crazy. And it just didn't really seem like a fast transition, but yet you're there. But more recently, Color Out of Space, the Richard Stanley Lovecraft adaptation, that's become my favorite horror film. I absolutely love that movie. Beyond that, I mean, there are a lot of horror. Pretty much any John Carpenter I love. And Christine's brilliant. I've seen it too many times, but it's brilliant. The Thing. I mean, you can't go wrong with. In the Mouth of Madness. Oh, that movie's insane. It just messes with your head. So yeah, those are kind of be my favorites.
Okay. You just said The Thing. Now I'm going back, because I'm older than you guys, to the original Thing.
Right, with James Arness.
James Arness. And again, I'm not a Siskel and Ebert here, and I'm not a great movie critic, but the dialogue in that movie was so riveting.
One of the fascinating things about that movie is the director for that film took a different stand than a lot of other directors in that the dialogue crosses over each other. I mean, it's not like they say, okay, it's your turn to talk, now it's your turn to talk. It kind of annoys me, but a lot of people really like it. I guess it's more realistic, but from the point of view of watching a movie, it sort of bugs me when I watch that movie, but I see why people like it.
Because to me, they're just talking, and you're right. To me, it creates more of a sense of reality. It's so. I just thought it was so real. The dialogue and the repartee, and it just gripped me. The reporter who's writing about this, and I mean, I just think it's outstanding. That's my own personal opinion.
If I may make one more point about that movie and the John Carpenter one of my little pet peeves, and it's just a silly thing, is that so many people you see will say, well, John Carpenter did a remake of that movie. No, he didn't. Both movies are based on the same short story, but one's not a remake of the other, despite what people think.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to do something I've never done with you guys. Well, with Gary, completely off topic, but I think it's a great question. You don't have to answer. It's a one-word thing. But here's the thing, I'll start with you, Gary, and we'll go around. Excluding family or friends, somebody you'd like to spend, somebody living or dead you'd like to spend a day with.
Or do I have to pick one?
You know, you can pick a couple. There's no rules here.
Stephen King would be one. And the funny thing is, I'm not a huge Stephen King fanatic. In fact, he writes in a completely opposite way from the way I do, because I'm a very minimalistic writer and he's the exact opposite of that. But he and I have a lot of common inspirations, and I think we'd find a lot in common to talk about. And it would be pretty interesting to chat with him about writing, because we do come from completely opposite angles on it. And obviously he's much more popular, but he would be one. And another one would certainly be David Tennant, because as I said, my favorite actor, and he seems like a really, really cool guy who's into fandom. And I think he'd be a lot of fun to hang out with.
Okay, Bill.
One of my favorite directors is probably Roger Corman, still around. I would love to sit and chat and have a little lunch with him. That would be that would be a lot of fun. You know, there are a number of writers. Lovecraft, I'm a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft. I've been told some of my works kind of follow some of what he does as well. So, you know, I have a little Lovecraft influence at least. So those would be definitely a couple of them.
Okay, Del.
I've been asked this question before, and I've never really been able to give a single answer like these guys. I love Bill's answer actually. Roger Corman would be, first of all, a very charming dinner companion, but also the stories he's gonna have are just gonna keep you like, you'd be like, no, you're not going anywhere, keep talking. So that's a great answer. But you know, I try to think about the people that had inspired me, and you know, they always say never meet your heroes. So I tried to leave people like Lovecraft out. I think literary wise, it would probably be somebody like Ray Bradbury. I would love to sit and talk with Ray Bradbury and just, well, rather sit and listen to Ray Bradbury. But just in overall, just how amazing it would be like Vincent Price or Christopher Lee. I mean, these two guys just live these lives that are so incredible. And Christopher Lee's is obviously a lot more, you know, fantastic and dangerous, and you know, being in the British Secret Service and all that. But you know, Vincent Price is got to be one of the most lovable people in the planet. And yeah, again, just the stories they would tell you would just be such great fun. So I'd have to go with one of those guys.
Vincent Price, I would love to just sit and listen to him talk. I mean, he could just, he could read from a phone book, and I would just sit there and be enamored and just, you know, hang on every word.
To this day, I still do. Anyway, I have a huge collection of people reading stories and telling stories on DVD and even tape. And you know, Christopher Lee doing Poe, that kind of stuff. But the ones that are my favorite, absolutely, are the Vincent Price ones, where he's reading these short stories, you know, that we've all heard of, you know, like Thus I Refute Beelzebub and stuff like that. And I try to listen to those around Halloween every year, you know, and because just hearing Vincent Price talk is so amazing. Tom Baker is another one. I just love hearing Tom Baker talk. I've always said that if I had some sort of navigational thing in my car, I would want it to be Tom Baker. So he'd be like, go left here, you know. Sort of
a Jelly Belly.
Wise voice. You know?
Jelly Baby.
Yeah.
Interesting answers, guys. I couldn't even answer it myself. I'm all over the place.
Could you come up with 5, 3?
Well, I personally, one of them goes back to biblical times. That's a heavy subject, or a little less heavy. George Washington.
Right.
You know, I'm always fascinated how they accomplished what they did with what they had, and their vision. You know, all these guys' vision in creating in creating a concept of government, for and by the people. Great stuff, but I'm all over the place.
Right.
I'm all over the place on that. Hey, Claude Rains, I'd love to chat with him. What a great character and actor. He played a great role in Casablanca, which is a movie that changed my life.
I watched that last night.
You're kidding.
No, I did.
Did you?
I
Oh,
did. Yeah.
wow. Well, I'm not plugging myself because I don't plug myself, but
Love that movie.
I wrote my first novel. It's a very spiritual thing. It's called Vichy Water, and it emanates from Casablanca.
Okay.
There's a whole bunch of Casablanca
Yeah.
in here, and it's because I watched Casablanca one morning 15, 16 years ago for the 50th, 60th time. I'm a little OCD, and I couldn't play tennis one morning. It was raining. I didn't know what to do. I'm sitting in my tennis shorts. So some energy comes to me and said, Calvin, go watch Casablanca. So I put it on for the 54th time 15 years ago. And I watched it at the very end. Rick shoots Major Strasser, and carry away the smile. The smile that Rick Blaine has, Humphrey Bogart, when Claude Rains tells the cops, the gendarmes, round up the usual suspects.
Yeah.
He has that faint smile because he knows he's saving him.
Yeah, I was a little late to Casablanca. It was one of those movies that, I caught it in the middle. I didn't want to, I turned it off because I didn't want to catch it in the middle. So eventually, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I finally said, all right, next time it comes on TCM, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to watch it. And, I was kind of into the top 100 movies of American Film Institute, trying to get through as many of those as I could for a while. I was like, okay, I got to sit. And I think that should be number one at this point.
It's pretty close to one or two.
It's
1, 2,
it's usually
3.
like 2 or 3 or something. Yeah,
The
Citizen Kane is
Godfather.
always first, which is also amazing. But
Yeah,
I think Casablanca it's like a movie watcher's movie. And if you don't mind me circling back to horror, you were talking about favorite movies. One of my all-time favorite of the classic horror movies is actually The Bride of Frankenstein, and I sometimes personally refer to that as the Casablanca of horror.
oh wow.
Because it is just like, it's kind of like Casablanca, where it's a movie person's movie. It's reality, but it's not reality. It's reality within its own world. And to me, Bride of Frankenstein does the same thing with horror. It's so perfectly put together. James Whale, another one of my all-time favorite directors, directed that. And I think that movie, to me, it's like a work of art. It's hardly even a movie. I can't glow on that one enough.
Okay. That was that Elsa Land. I'm trying to remember who played.
Yeah, Elsa Lanchester.
Right.
Elsa Lanchester, yes.
Okay.
She has like less than 2 minutes of screen time, and
Yep.
her image has become iconic.
Iconic.
Yeah.
I mean, indelible.
Absolutely.
Indelible. Great stuff. So I guess we should come back because we can go on, and there's so many things. We should come back, and I'll leave that in Gary's department. Gary, please tell people Lifeblood 2 where, and why don't you all just do a little bit of contact stuff so people can know where to reach you. Take it away, Gary.
Okay, for Lifeblood 2, you can pick that up at lulu.com/spotlight/strange sound, or if you go to garyhillauthor.com and you click on the Tales of Wonder and Dread link, you'll see there are a couple pages of books there, and you can get a link to it there. It'll say Goodreads, which takes you to the Goodreads listing. I think there's either says Lulu or paperback for the paperback version, and then hardcover for the hardcover version. And you can pick that up, and that's Lifeblood 2. And you can get the first one there too. Might as well buy them both at the same time.
Okay, Bill, your contacts info.
My contacts, of course, we talked about my group, Classic Camps, Classic Horror Emporium. I also write a blog, although I haven't done it in a while. Classic Camps, Classic Blog. I am Classic Camp. And actually, we talked about the music connection earlier. I should have brought this up then, but the name Classic Camp, if you go on the blog and you see the one blog that was about a bio, comes from classic rock music. Because in college, I had a column called Classic Camp, all about classic rock music. And that's where actually the name comes from. So I had my rock phase in there as well, you know. But
So
anyway, yeah,
we've all got the music angle too.
That's right. Start with horror, go to music, and then go back to horror. Apparently seems to be the thing. But if you don't mind me throwing a couple of extra plugs out there,
Yes.
I also have a poem out right now in Alternative Deathiness, an anthology of short stories and poetry all about death and dying. So, and mine was inspired by one of the oldest churches in continental United States, which is not too far from where I live in Smithfield, Virginia. It's titled Old Forgotten Grave, and I just wrote a little poem about the old graves that you see with the washed away lettering. You can barely even see the name or anything. And I also have a short story coming out, should be out by before the end of the year, I think, in Madame Gray's Potpourri, POE-POURRI. So all stories
cool.
inspired by Poe.
Right.
And my short story in that one will be Beheaded, will be coming out.
Yeah.
Okay. There's delmerritt.com where you can go and find my books in addition to links to Gary's books. I think I've been included in the last 4 books that he's made. So those are on there. But I just released a book this week, which is the second in a series called The Chronicles of the Black Queen, which is a very, very adult horror fantasy, dark fantasy kind of thing. And I also put out one called Dark Wizardry, which is not quite as adult centric, but still pretty adult centric. And next, I'm not sure what I'm working on next. I think it's going to be a book called Darksome, and I hope to have that out in a couple months. Which most of these books are, as I've talked to Gary about this, most of these books are actually pretty nasty. They'd be rated R or X if they were movies, let's say. So the younger viewers want to stay away from that. But yeah, delmerritt.com, you can take a look at that stuff.
Perfect. Perfect. This is a great way to do a wrap, guys. Please come back. We can just go on and on and on. And there's great infiltrations of my journalism and the spiritual stuff, and there's combinations of both, and it's like endless. And I think this was great, really, and good chemistry, and great special effects with Del. So, you know,
I missed my calling.
This is great special effects, and it's really it's really growing on me the more I'm watching you. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for this, and please do come back. I'm going to officially sign off, but don't disappear. We'll do an official wrap. But thanks so much, guys. Truly, this was great.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Thank you.